Hey, that's the title, JavaScript Junk in
Awesome.
Rails 7.
Just so that everyone knows, I have started the recording, so it is recorded at this point, and that will get posted on YouTube. So next, Riaz, what will you be talking about when it gets to your turn?
So my talk is called Pry Irresponsibly. It's about how to explain this. Um, it's kind of a funny talk. It's about ways to write softwares in very irresponsible ways. You should never do, but it's very helpful to actually learn about how dynamic Ruby is.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Looking forward to it. So without further ado, Dave, why don't you get started?
All right. Let's see. See how this is going to work. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Sure can. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right. So I'm Dave Kimura. My Twitter handle that you can find me online or anywhere is @Cobalt. I just got over COVID, so if I'm coughing, I'm sorry. I don't have a quick, easy mute button to hit, so y'all will just have to suffer through it with me. But I do screencasting on driftandruby.com, and I do offer this Atlanta Ruby users group a discount, the ATL rug. So you can sign up for $9 a month, down from the $15 a month. But in this talk today, we're going to be talking about Rails 7, and it is not yet released. They do have on GitHub's main branch, it is an alpha. And specifically, there are so many new features coming into Rails 7, and that's anything from encrypting your attributes at the database level and a whole bunch of other features. But one of the more notable features, or I don't even know if you want to call it a feature, one of the more notable changes that's coming out is how JavaScript is getting handled. So this talk is going to be basically all about JavaScript, which is kind of odd for a Ruby talk, but because it is part of the core Rails, I felt like it's important to touch on and address. And we are seeing things move around really rapidly right now in the Rails 7 communities. So those who are keeping up to date with what's going on in Rails 7, you probably have noticed new gems coming out and a lot of changes that have been happening fairly rapidly. And so if you remember back in the more Rails legacy days, if you needed to use JavaScript or any kind of CSS library, you brought in a gem, and that gem was often just a wrapper for your application or for that JavaScript library. And then you would include the assets into your asset pipeline via sprockets and all that good stuff. Sorry. And then with Rails 5 and 6 came Webpacker. And while that was a huge mind shift over into how we are handling our JavaScript assets, it also made it a lot easier to keep track of our JavaScript library versions that we're using and a lot of that kind of stuff. It just made it a bit more simple. But with that simplicity also came a lot more complexity. Whether we had to run a separate service just so we got some live reloading, or coming down to the production side, you having to include Node.js and just the other headaches that came along with Webpacker beyond a simple configuration. So with Rails 7, we now have kind of branched off, and we now have a few different routes that we can choose to go. One of the most unobtrusive routes into a Rails application is with import maps. And the idea behind that is using modern technology of JavaScript libraries that are packaged in a way that we can then just create a reference to them. And I'll go ahead and say up front that I don't think the import maps is my preferred way of handling it. I think it's a bit too drastic of a change right now, but this is going to be the default as we come into new Rails applications. So starting off with a Rails application with import maps may not be a horrible route or a bad way to go, but as we'll see throughout this lightning talk, there are going to be some nuances with it that may make you want to just kind of stick to a more traditional route. But in order to get started with import maps, if you are on a Rails 6 application, and if you're kind of going through an upgrade path to Rails 7, you simply just bundle add the import map -rails, and then you run the Rails import map install. And from there, along with Rails 7, another popular library is Hotwire. So if you want to run the Hotwire Rails and then run the Rails Hotwire install, then that's just going to work as you normally would. It's fully supported with import maps, with bringing in the appropriate libraries to the proper spots. So with import maps, if we want to use an external JavaScript library, so something outside of the Rails ecosystem, which I do consider Hotwire being part of the Rails ecosystem, since it did come from Basecamp, it is under the Rails GitHub account and pretty much supported there. But if we wanted to bring in something from the outside, then we can use a new executable that's given to us with import maps, and that's found under the bin folder. So we can run bin import map. We can pin, which is going to bring into our application a reference to this library, and we can bring in something like sortable.js. If you have a preference of where you want this library to come from, which CDN, then you can add a -- from, and then something like JS deliver. Otherwise, it's going to default to jspm.io. And so when you pin something like sortable.js, or if you bring in a library like Hotwire, then this is going to be the import map.rb file that gets updated and created. So we have our typical pin application, which is going to be anything under our application.js file that gets included in. And then we have our references to Stimulus and Turbo. Then we have our pin sortable to a external CDN. And this is probably one of the things that I like least about import maps is that right within our code, and this gets delivered up to the front end. So the browser will go out and fetch these resources. So you essentially are putting your eggs into the jspm.io basket, which if something happens to them, but you have no issues with your application, then your application will be performing in a degraded mode. So they do have some workarounds with this where you can just download this ESM, bring it into your application into a vendors folder, and then pin it from there. But by default, when you pin it, a external library like this, then it's going to go out to a CDN. So it's a little bit strange, but this is the current default in Rails 7. And so when we go to consume something like this, sortable.js, in a stimulus controller, typically on our import controller, this has changed in our reference from stimulus to now @hotwired/stimulus. And that's because, and if we also look at the next line, the import sortable from sortable.js, those two references that are in yellow and highlighted actually come from our import map, where we have on the second line the @hotwired/stimulus, and the last line pin sortable. So those two references, those strings, that's where it's actually getting reference from. And we can just consume it like we normally would as if we were still in the Webpack days. And that all seems to work pretty good. So the way this will look on the front end is we would have this script tag, which its contents is this JSON, this hash of information with these different import references. So you could even see where we have the sortable JS reference pulling from a CDN. And not all browsers support this. So one trick that they do include by default, if you are using import maps, is the ES module shim, which will basically allow this new technology to work across browsers that may not support it yet. So at a super high level, this is import maps. That's going to be the default in Rails 7. Then a few days ago or a week ago or so, DHH also announced ES build and rollup.js for Rails, which is a different way that you could take, really just a different approach to managing your JavaScript assets in your Rails applications. And so to get started with ES build, which I found, and I'll say that this has been my most preferred way to handle assets in Rails 7 so far, I found it to be the most intuitive as well as the easiest to get started with, as well as upgrading, having an upgrade path from a Rails 6 application to 7. I think it's going to be a lot easier with ES build than any other solution offered so far. But to get started with this, it's now all bundled, whether you're using Webpack, Rollup, or ES Build into the JS bundling-rails gem. So you can just do a bundle add JS bundling-rails into your gem file. It'll add that gem. And then you can run something like a bin rails JavaScript :install :ES build to bring in that library into your application. It'll create all the references and the manifest that's needed in order to get that going. And it also works with Hotwire just as we would expect. So the one big difference here is with import maps, you did not need to have the Node runtime installed on your development machine or in your production environment at all. With ES build, you will need Node as well as Yarn, because Yarn is going to be how you add in your libraries. Just like we did with the Webpacker days, we could do a Yarn add sortable JS, and that'll bring it into the appropriate spots into our manifests where things get loaded in, and then we can consume it as we would expect. So we have the exact same stimulus controller that we would with import maps that we do with ES build, and it more or less just works. Because we are using ES build and we don't have anything like Babel or any other kind of tie-in, this isn't going to work right out of the box. Instead, we had to come into our index.js under our controllers to then specify and load in our stimulus controllers as we would maybe not even normally would, but this is something that would be the process that you would have to remember when creating a new stimulus controller in Rails 7 using ES build, is to come into your controllers folder, index.js, and then import in your position controller reference or something like that. But in order for all of this to work and tie in and you start using it with your application, you do have to run yarn build -- watch. And in order for that to work properly, you will have your Rails server running, and then you'll have the yarn build watch running. And as you make changes in your JavaScript, in your application.js or stimulus controller, then it's going to automatically rebuild this application.js. And it gets stored under your app assets builds, and there'll just be an application.js, which that file that gets continuously built is what's going to be shipped to the browser. So when you run the Rails assets precompile on a production environment, then this will actually run the yarn build to build out that application.js file with the appropriate digest and everything that you would expect. And once you do this, it's not that many steps, and it's pretty familiar if you are already coming from Webpacker. Then you get a nice little sortable list that you can add in. I'm almost done. So I think I have 10 more slides. So there are some other considerations. When you bring in JavaScript assets via Yarn like you would with Webpacker, so think Bootstrap, you would add in the import, the Bootstrap dist, CSS, all your style sheets into Webpacker or through Webpacker, and then that would get served normally. The problem with Rails 7 and ES Build is that you don't have that luxury, and it's going to actually be better. And this is going to be a bit contradictory, but for the most part, it's going to be better to add the node modules into your assets path. And then for your style sheets with something like Bootstrap, in your application.css, you would then just require Bootstrap, and that would work as you would expect. But there is a little caveat with that, because just a few days ago, DHH announced CSS bundling. And so this is the other bit that gets tied in with ES Build, Rollup, Import Maps, and it's a way that you can then manage your CSS bundling. And the idea here is similar how the ES Build would create an app assets build application.js. CSS bundling will create your application.css within that same build folder. None of this is checked into your code repository, but instead it's just built for your local development. We run Rails assets precompile. Both ES Build and the CSS bundling will then build out, create the appropriate application CSS and JS with the digest, and would then serve it up in production. But to get started with something like this, you would just do a bundle add CSS bundling -Rails. You have your choice between Tailwind, Post CSS, or Dart Sass, and then you can run the Rails CSS :install : and then something like Tailwind. But with Rails 7, you won't have to do any of this bundle add. You won't have to add the JS bundling -Rails to your gem file. You won't need to add the CSS bundling -Rails to your gem file, because in Rails 7, you will have an option when you create a new application to just add the -J flag, and then you can add ES Build, Rollup, or Webpack if you still want to go the Webpack route, and the -CSS to add the Tailwind, Post CSS, or the Dart Sass, whichever one you want there. So you can do this right from creating a new Rails application. It'll pull in the appropriate libraries that's needed for those and install them without you having to manually do those. So just a couple of resources. I do have a couple of videos out on Drift and Ruby. They are the most recent episodes. So if you head over to driftandruby.com, there's an episode for the ES Build for Rails, as well as import map in Rails 7. And then also, just so you see under the GitHub repository, they have the import map -Rails, JS bundling -Rails, and CSS bundling -Rails. And again, head over to driftandruby.com, use the promo code LandedRug for a discount. And again, I'm Dave Kimura, and you can find me on Twitter @Cobalt. That's it.
Anyone have questions for Dave? I was going to ask this weird script tag of type import map that I never heard of. So is that a browser feature that has a shim, or is it something that the shim has invented?
So Chrome by itself, Chrome does support it, and Microsoft Edge supports it natively, I believe. But you would need the shims for something like Safari, or if you know anyone using Internet Explorer. I don't know if Firefox has full compatibility yet either.
How is it?
Is import maps is import maps something that is built by the Rails team, or is it part of the larger JavaScript landscape?
It's part of the larger JavaScript landscape. And this was actually, I think Basecamp is using ES Build within the actual Basecamp application, but they are using import maps in Hey, I believe.
Awesome. So now instead of one way of doing JavaScript in Rails plus the old school of just putting in the template, we'll have 3 ways of doing JavaScript in Rails that we'll have to support for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and I really think the import maps is going to be the biggest cultural shock to those who are jumping into it. But the ES build route, I think, is going to be the most simple. Because with import maps, we're very accustomed, if you've been using Webpacker, to simply just do import and then whatever CSS files that were included in that JavaScript library, whether it's Bootstrap, Tailwind, Full Calendar, whatever. And you can't do that with import maps because import maps is going to specifically be around the JavaScript library aspect. And so you still have that gap for CSS. And that's perhaps where the CS bundling library can come into play if you are using import maps. But I haven't done much investigation on that yet.
Okay.
Well, I think whatever Rails decides is the default is, I mean, it's the tyranny of the default, right? Whatever they decide is the default is going to be the most common thing out there, right? So what, when you do, when you build just a regular Rails project, what do you get?
Yeah. And that is true to a point. But then again, honestly, Spring was the default in Rails. And I've had in my Rails RC file for the past many years skip Spring. So just because Rails offers it as a default doesn't mean that is the golden path or the best way. That is a very small set of people's saying this is the best way that we think it should go, but every team will be different. And I think as long as you're still sticking to the Rails way, whether it is with the import maps, ES build, rollup, then, or even still Webpack is going to be supported at least through Rails 7. Rails 8, I could see it going away, but you can't go wrong there.
So also on Firefox, I think you can use it with the shim, but there is a feature request open, and their answer is basically they don't think they're going to be implementing this for a long time. So it's not on their radar. I don't know about Safari, but the shim should still work. So maybe if more people use it, then their answer basically in the bug was like, we just don't have time. It wasn't really like we don't like it. It was like, we don't have time. And I was like, interesting.
Yeah. So it is good that they provide the shims by default.
Yeah.
Which I haven't tested out Firefox with import maps, but I would imagine with the shims that there would be relatively good compatibility.
Yeah, I think to your point, basically, like if you think of most of how we've been doing all JavaScript development for like 5 years, it's all essentially a shim because we're all base transpiling anyways. So I don't know if this would be that much different.
Honestly, I have found instances where I am so tired of Webpacker and all the complexity that I have started moving towards as plain vanilla JavaScript in a script include tag as possible. I don't know if on anything serious yet, but I'm toying with the idea of like, is the juice worth the squeeze and all this complexity that we have? Because it's, if anything sends a developer into a multi-day debugging service, it's it on a legacy app, it seems to be a breakdown in the asset pipeline or Webpacker somewhere during the upgrade.
Well, I guess that's what they're trying to tackle. So it's good feature for that.
Yep. Well, thank you, Dave. Oh, go on.
A different approach could be just not try to build your front end with Rails. That's not the default choice. That's not what Basecamp goes with, but you could just have a completely standalone single page application built using, React starter app or whatever modern tool set, and then you deploy your backend separately.
Yeah.
I never think that's a good route, honestly. I'll push back on that probably till the day I die. But that is a very popular route that I think boot camps are partially responsible for, with pushing, React front ends and Rails back ends. But with Hotwire and Stimulus JS and Turbo with the Turbo streams, I think that we can create super rich front end applications in Rails without ever needing to touch much JavaScript at all. But
I agree. I actually have a
get the point of
perfect.
Hotwire.
I'm sorry, what was that, Dimitri?
I said I get the point of Hotwire. There's definitely rationale there.
Yeah.
I have a testing production application that I built in Rails 6 preview, and just recently bumped it up to a more recent, but it has been being used by my co-founder for that second business all this time for his core business, and we're looking at expanding it out. So we've effectively had like a technology like hardcore testing of the app for over a year and a half, and honestly nothing has come up that I've had to change from the prototype. Just a few little gem bumps as like, Dependabot found something worth patching. And so keeping an app super simple has a huge upside, I guess, is the only thing I'm saying.
And that's a pretty good thing to say. I mean, the most maintainable Rails application is the ones that sit closest to the Rails core. If you deviate from it too much, then you are going to have dependency nightmares when you try to upgrade down the road, potentially.
Yep. Sorry I have to be so vague about what. Actually, I can say it. It's remember.com. It's a call recording app for classes of businesses that depend on verbal contracts. It's gotten harder to do that natively, and so it's actually a cloud-based service that is built upon Twilio. But he literally outgoing and ingoing calls all get recorded and automatically transcribed. And then you can search through the text of them to find where, like, the insurance adjuster said they would pay for something, and then they got amnesia like 2 weeks later. And you have to go back and say, actually, I was just checking my notes. And you said, oh, yeah, I guess I did. So you can start thinking about what that means for those types of businesses, if you like.
How do you deal with the legal issues? Because like in a huge number of states, you're not allowed to record and transcribe calls.
So Georgia is not one of those. So if one of the users is in Georgia, especially the owner of the account, and right now on the service, we make, obviously we don't have a lot of users, we make them assert that they are legally recording, which is what Twilio does too. And then the workaround, if you really need to, is to have an announcement thing about this call may be recorded for quality control purposes. So you just kind of play with that. I mean,
Yeah,
those laws are meant
there's
to protect
actually-
people. They're not meant as a gotcha. But
Yeah.
for all those two-party consent states, there are single-party consents, and that can be the user. What you cannot do, and what we have to be careful about, is recording calls of other people, which is one reason that in this initial release we're making it like a solo professional sign up, and we're even though the backend has the ability to do like corporate account kind of things, that's one of our pauses is what liability is there for like the corporate boss like listening to everyone's calls, and is it obvious to them that they are. So anyway, So I'm going to go ahead and stop